Marxism is a theory of capital accumulation. The theory says basically the history of capitalism is about its increase and its expansion. It's the way in which it expands by profit seeking, so that it has to grow. And so the total economy of the world back in 1950 was about $9 trillion, and it's now closer to $90 trillion. So you get some notion of the sort of rapidity of the expansion, and capital has to expand or die. And under those conditions, everything that goes on under capital is very much about trying to accommodate to that expansionary pressure, so that we get all these pressures on the environment. We get these pressures on increasing labor supply, on increasing consumerism, on increasing everything. Everything has to grow, grow, and grow. And what Marxism kind of says is, well, first off, you can't grow forever, particularly at an exponential rate. And as you grow, you start to create all kinds of particular problems of the environment. And you know, when Marx was writing, capital was established in a very small corner of the world, which was Western Europe and Britain and the eastern seaboard of the United States. And now, of course, it's everywhere. It incorporates China. It incorporates what was once the Soviet Union. So we're living in a world which is in a spiral form of expansion. And that creates all these stresses, and then that creates geopolitical stresses. Now, since 1945, essentially the world, the free world, as it was then called, was basically dominated, of course, by the United States, and US domination continued up until about the 1980s, 1990s, and now we find ourselves in a situation where the US, I think, is being threatened. Its domination is being threatened by China, by actually developments around the world in general. And so there's a sort of desperate attempt, it seems to me, by the US establishment to try to maintain its position somehow or other. And in particular, I think about the war in the Ukraine, which is horrible in terms of its implications and what is happening and everything, which I don't think I'd have to sort of go into that in order to say that I tend towards the pacifist end of things. But on the other hand, there are such things as just wars. But this is a very unjust war. And the big problem is how to bring it to an end. There's a lot to be said about how it came to be, but how can it be brought to an end? And I think actually my view would be that it could be brought to an end by the G20 pressuring the two leading powers in the world, which are China and the United States, to actually make sure that this comes to an end. In other words, but my fear is that the United States doesn't want it to come to an end. I really think that actually it sees this possibility as a moment in which it can reassert its hegemony in the world. And this was said specifically by one of the generals who kind of said, our objective, he said, in the Ukraine thing, is to so diminish and degrade Russia's military capacity that they will never be able to intervene in the world again. And now this is very much what the US is about. And they're taking the same tack economically with China by trying to limit the availability of high tech and chip making and all the rest of it. So that what we're in is a very, very dangerous situation right now, where something that could be brought to an end by, say, US and China sitting down and saying, how can we put pressure on both sides to end this? They're not going to do that because the United States right now doesn't want to do that. It's actually benefiting a lot from fighting a proxy war against Russia. And this proxy war has all of these terrible, terrifying kinds of aspects to it, which I'm sure everybody in the audience would want to see brought to an end as fast as possible. What do you think, Rick?
Well, I'm sure there'll be things where we disagree, but on nothing you've said do I find any basis for disagreement. Let me take it a little bit further and to talk about the specific contribution, in a sense, that Marxism makes that lies behind so much of what you've just said. If you read the mainstream story about post-World War II development right up until Ukraine and the role now China plays, Whether it's from the left or the right, one of the things immediately obvious to you, if you look at it through a Marxian lens, is the absence of any reference to capitalism. We are told these events happen because Xi Jinping has this or that objective politically. We're given psychological profiles of Mr. Putin or Mr. Zelensky, or we're told that this all has to do with freedom and decency and equity. I'm struck by the speech of President Biden a few days ago, and echoed by his officials, about how it's all peace and freedom and democracy that we're fighting over, while they were signing the arrangements to let the leader of the Saudi Arabia get out from under culpability for the murder of that reporter a few years. I mean, that anyone would take it seriously is now in doubt, and I'm glad of it. But what Marxism does is say, no, there needs to be an underlying explanation. You have to root what you're saying about Ukraine, China, and so on in the Marxian apparatus, which puts the question of capitalism and how it works and why it works that way right in the core of the explanation. It's not the only thing. It's not meant to exclude all manner of other subjects. But the excluding of the capitalism feature is right. What our counterparties, what our conservatives and liberals are busy doing. And it seems that for me, what's interesting, and where I would, I love what David was saying, is that you're beginning to ground the conversation in questions of capital accumulation. How is that accumulation going? In capitalism's history, it's fraught, for example, with terrible instability. Every 4 to 7 years, there's a crash. Large numbers of people are thrown out of work. These people want a job, but they don't get one. A quarter of our industrial capacity, for example, in this country is now not being utilized. We have enormous unmet social needs, and we have a society that can't put together, as Marx stressed, the unemployed people, the unused capacity, and the need for output for all the different social problems that we have. And what does a society do when it's confronted with the problems, or as Marx might have called them, the contradictions of capitalism? Weaving that into the analysis is, I think, what a study of Marxism enables and provokes you to do. And it's an enormous corrective to the superficiality of what goes on in the mass media with these real crises that we face.
I agree entirely with that, and I think that you can look at this also in a couple of different ways. At the same time as this war is going on in Ukraine, there are kind of maneuvers going on within capital which are very distressing. For example, Ukraine has been granted absolution from its debts for a couple of years from the major powers. But in return for that, it has to open up all of its lands to the purchase by foreigners, because in 1999, it found that, Ukraine is a very rich country, and it has a huge kind of productive capacity, particularly with respect to food grains. And all of the agribusiness wants to get in there and own that land and take it up and monopolize it. And so what Ukraine found itself doing was prevent foreign ownership of the land, and it legislated that back at the end of the 1990s. But in return for this largesse in terms of the debt retirement, basically what Ukraine has agreed to is to allow foreign interests to completely enter in and control the land. The same thing has happened in the labor market. The labor market used to be working under kind of ex-Soviet lines. Now it's neoliberalized. So in effect, one of the things that's going on at the same time as this war is going on is the total neoliberalization of Ukrainian society. So this is, again, the US and everybody else pushing that economic process. Now, I'm not saying that's the only thing going on, but when you start to look at these things, you start to see that actually these economic interests are terribly important. All the big agribusinesses, Cargill, Monsanto, and so on, would love to get in there and own all that and monopolize the grain trade. And because Ukraine has about a big chunk of the global grain trade, and actually that in itself, by the way, may be one of the reasons why this will come to an end too, because shortage of food grains and food security around the world is becoming a big issue, and the G20 folk are beginning to say, hey, listen, this is getting dangerous for all of us, and so something has to be done to bring it to. And again, I don't want to sound like an economic determinist, but the interesting thing is, as you said, everything is personalized, and it's about, Putin's personal vision versus, Zelensky's and so on, when actually there's a lot of, economic force going on under the radar, as it were, to have major impacts on how the global economy is going to function. And I think right now we may be headed into a crisis form, but the crisis this time will be partially as a result of the interruptions in food security at the global kind of level. And that is a kind of crisis in which we're already seeing famine going on in large parts of Africa. And we're beginning to see these sorts of issues cropping up around, with people kind of saying, how did that happen? Well, part of it happened because this is a capitalistic war. And it's about wars of economic systems. And of course, partly the whole conflict with China is a war over the nature of the economic system and how that economic system is going to work. But that's again, something which I think we should be paying very close attention to.
Yeah, again, I would add one wrinkle to all of that. Capitalism is full of contradictions. Whatever it does to advance or solve a problem in a nod to Hegel creates yet another problem. And let me give you an example, following up on what David just said. France has a very interesting institution, 25 years old. It's called the École de Guerre Économique, the School of Economic Warfare. And they've just issued a report last month. And here's the contradiction it highlights. I'm going to now summarize. But Marxism, the lens through which I make sense of the world, is what brought me to that institute, to that report, and to what I'm about to say to you now. That report says that the biggest danger to France as a capitalist system, which is recognized by them, is the United States, not China, not Russia, not the United States. It actually lists in rank order the dangers. Why? In their view, and these are people with the closest possible linkages to the largest capitalist interests in France, okay? In their view, the war in the Ukraine is not only, as David said, something the United States seems to want in an open-ended kind of way, but is part of economic warfare against Europe. And they don't want to be part of it. They see the absurd surge of inflation as having to do with the sanctions that the Americans wanted to put on Russia. They went along with it, but now they're suffering the consequences. The Russians aren't, the Americans aren't. The actual protagonists are both solving their technical difficulties with their policy, but Europe is left with politicians hung out to dry because they went along with it, even though their people now can't get the food they want, can't get the energy they want, can't get the gasoline they want. And they're angry, and they don't want Mr. Macron to continue. It's part of the reason why Macron is already playing kind of both sides if you watch what he's doing. Right. And I think you're going to see, we may be surprised this time with the relative decline of the United States, the relative rise of China, that the ability to ride roughshod over the junior partners of the Western alliance, that may be very much fractured in the years ahead. And I think that the Marxian analysis of the accumulation problems for the Europeans. The report by this École de Guerre Économique also makes the point with bitterness that the United States, in their view, has dropped Great Britain as the long-standing ally to sort of manage Europe, and that the Germans now want to be in that position, which is why they have reversed their policy, become big gung-ho supporters in Ukraine. Has nothing to do with Ukraine. Goes back to David's first point. They're trying to solve the problems of a capitalism in trouble, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. And Ukraine is only interesting if it helps rather than hinders that process. And they're coming to the conclusion that by and large, it's hindering that process for them. How that works out in the realm of Ukraine war, there's no way to predict. But the old alliance with the United States at the helm, that's being questioned and challenged from all sides.
And one of the theoretical points that I would, you may disagree with this, but one of the theoretical points that I work with a lot is this idea of overaccumulation and the problems of the surplus and the absorption of the surplus over time. And what Marx does at a certain point is to start to kind of say, well, you know, the surplus, which is used to generate more surplus, is problematic. And so there have to be some sinks, if you like, in which you can get rid of surplus in various ways. And there's a wonderful point in the Grundrisse where he says, well, actually, if you really want to get rid of overaccumulated capital, then going to war is a good way to do it. He said, because going to war is just like, you know, chucking surplus into the ocean. And so actually wartime activities, and this is again something I want to emphasize to people when you see this headline that says the United States is giving $40 billion to Ukraine. Actually, what it's doing is giving $40 billion to the defense industry in the United States to build the stuff to send to Ukraine. So there's a wonderful kind of way in which the surplus is being disposed of, but being disposed of in such a way that it increasingly centralizes capital in these large industrial corporations which are producing armaments and high-tech kinds of things, so that this kind of overaccumulation idea is terribly important, and it leads into one of the phrases I use is this idea of a spatial fix, that when you get a country and you've absorbed, saturated it, if you like, with capitalist development, you start to go abroad, and so you start to see the export of capital abroad and all that kind of thing. So how to dispose of the surplus. Do you do it by geographical expansion, which gets you into imperialist politics at a certain point? Or do you do it wastefully by going to war and, in effect, chucking the surplus into the ocean? So all of these things are going on at the same time as we start to see this global economy, which is kind of teetering around in the ways you say, lurching towards some sort of crisis, which is likely to be a crisis either on the supply side, which would be food deprivation and all of the things which are coming out of the current situation, or whether it's about sort of overaccumulation and all of the problems of overaccumulation that come out. I mean, through this expansion, by the way, we get this also connection to the ecological problems and the degradation of the environment and climate change and all the rest of it. So that the theory of overaccumulation, to me, is terribly important. It's part of that aspect of Marx's theory, which I think plays a very crucial role in this geopolitics and geopolitical struggles which are going on around the world between different countries as they jockey for positions in this kind of situation. And again, Marx has a nice kind of thing where he says, when everything's going fine, all the capitalists are friendly with each other. The capitalist corporations love each other. Capitalist countries love each other. When the downturn comes, they all hate each other and they try to dump the consequences of the downturn on somebody else. So we're in one of those situations right now. And I think this is why it is so dangerous when you start to connect the economic imperatives with the geopolitical, geoeconomic imperatives.
And yet that's one of the great strengths of Marxism, that it will not let you look at an issue like a war or any other major social issue
Right.
without asking and answering questions. Where is the surplus? Who's producing this surplus? Who's getting that surplus? How do they distribute this surplus? What are the social effects of how the surplus is organized? And, coming out of the academic economics world, I have to tell you, because it's stark, my colleagues, my education at all the fanciest universities, there was no discussion of the surplus. The surplus doesn't exist. If you look in the index of all the major textbooks that I have had to use to teach my classes, you can't go through the index and find surplus. Or if you do, it's weird notions of psychological surplus that consumers have, but nothing remotely like it. It's a refusal of the profession to weave into its analysis what Marx was able to contribute, an insight into the production and distribution of surplus. It's a fantastic contribution on a scale every bit as powerful as, say, Sigmund Freud teaching us that we have multiple levels of consciousness. We have a consciousness, a subconscious, an unconscious, and that how to think about them. Spectacular rethinking of the human experience. That's what Marxism is.